So I've actually done a couple of videos on the saddest character deaths of Buffy, The Last Kingdom, Black Sails, and The Lord of the Rings, and a couple of others as well. And as I was doing those, I was finding that there was a lot of similarities for the characteristics of what became the saddest death. And as I was thinking about it, I came up with sort of a list of what actually makes the saddest character death. And so today in this video, we're going to be talking about what makes character deaths hit so hard. Before we get started, I want to say a quick hello and welcome all. This is Eclectic Kelpie, where we dive into the treasured trove of fantastical media. Quick spoiler warning for Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Black Sails, The Last Kingdom, and The Lord of the Rings, because we are going to be using those shows as references for the list of what makes a saddest character death and why it hits so hard when we watch it and why it makes such an emotional impact. And the specifier for this video is we're going to be talking about how tragic death scenes hit, as opposed to the cheer-worthy heroic deaths as also seen on screen. Today we are all about the sobbing, the ugly crying, heart-wrenching, still feeling hollow after 3 days with the level of impact that these character deaths left us with. And without further ado, let's dive into what makes a character's tragic death hit so hard. Firstly, and probably most importantly, the biggest component that creates the utter heart-wrenching sadness of a character's death is us as viewers observing how the characters are reacting to that person's death. For example, one of the saddest deaths of all time that was done so incredibly beautifully was the death of Buffy's mom in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Just how we see Buffy come into the space, immediately freak out, the whole trying to save her mom, how she comes to a quiet numbness at the end when she's on the phone with the 911 operator and she's saying she's cold and she just kind of drops, and we see how deeply that affects her and how that in turn deeply affects us as the viewers. Because she's so distraught, we feel that devastation and internalize it because these characters are connected with us as the viewers. We are experiencing their POVs, and so their emotions are dictating how we should be reacting. We observe it, we see the gravity of how these characters are responding to these deaths, and then as the audience, we're internalizing it and then getting to feel that sadness and have the ugly cries because it means so much. And we also see it as well with Éowyn and how she sort of breaks down when King Theoden dies. And even also in the extended edition, even though Éowyn isn't dead, when Éomer finds her on the battlefield and thinks that she's dead, and the just visceral cry that Karl Urban does is just insane. And so even though she doesn't die, that still, if she was dead, that reaction would have amplified it so exponentially because of how deeply we see the character be affected. It's the same thing in The Last Kingdom, where Uhtred, after Father Beocca dies, he's so distraught. And then we see how he reacts and just breaks down and completely is devastated and just sobs and experiences that deep grief, and so we can vicariously, the audience, experience that grief. It's very much because the whole point of having a main character and having that POV character is to allow the audience to attach our emotional connectedness with that character, and so we feel that character suffering. We feel that connection with their sorrows and their excitements and all of the good emotions that they feel. So then when they experience incredible loss, we also have that gateway into that emotional experience. And even in quieter ways as well, being able to see, like, Boromir's death, for example, Aragorn does it with reverence, and it does make it a very sad experience. We don't need to see him break down to be able to know that there's so much gravity to it. Just that single tear, just that how he's treating the body and how he sends it over the waterfall. Like, we are able to get the impact and feel the devastation through the experience of the character's POV who is responding and reacting to that character's death. So how the characters react and how we get to connect to the world through that character's POV, and how their sorrow and their grief impacts our sorrow and our grief. The characters' reactions have such a big impact in indicating how we're supposed to experience this event and how we're supposed to be feeling this grief and this sorrow and the anguish based on another character's death, like Buffy's mom or King Theoden or Father Bayaka. Having that emotional connection through the main character's POV really amplifies the experience of having that character's death hit so hard for us as the viewers, because we're sharing in that anguish and we're sharing in that grief. Next, what makes a character's death hit so hard and be so sad is having lasting implications for that character's death and long-lasting impact on the grand world as a whole. So for example, the death of King Alfred, I think that was the saddest death in The Last Kingdom. Well, his and Father Bayaka's and Tura's, which you can absolutely watch all of the saddest character deaths of the shows that we're talking about after this video. But Alfred's death, I think, has extreme implications for the rest of the story. It is so sad and has impact on the world. It has impact on the characters, as we see, and that's why it's also so sad, as we can see how the characters are responding to that death, but also having the impact on the world. All of the political components change, the vying for power on the throne. There's so many things that Alfred's death are the catalyst for. And so when we refer back to it like, oh, I wish he was still here, having that death be called back to continues to make it hit, continues to make it sad, continues to evoke those feelings of grief and sorrow because that character's no longer there anymore. I also imagine it's probably sad also for the actors missing their coworkers, in some instances, I'm sure, but it just very much for the story, when a character's impact is felt and then when they're gone, it still reverberates through the story, and yeah, it just makes it hit more because it's felt and continues to be felt as the story continues. And again, I think Buffy's mom is going to be an example for quite a few of these, but again, with Buffy's mom, you know, even though it was season 5 and there was only 2 seasons after, that was a grand event. It continued to affect Buffy and Dawn and a few of the other characters as the season continued, as the series continued, because that was such a huge loss. And I think that losing a parent, especially in the way that Buffy's mom passed away, really left a lot of impact. And even the calling back a couple of episodes later with, you know, when Buffy's house gets trashed and she's thinking about, like, how did my mom, like, manage to repair all of this stuff? Like, how was she able to continue making everything work despite all of the catastrophe and danger, and she was always able to hold it together. And so that really was like a role model character for Buffy in how to function in the world and how to, you know, like take care of others in a subtle way rather than in her grand save the world kind of way. So it really hits, and then you start feeling sad again when they bring up the character not being there anymore, and especially when it's, you know, as big of an impact as Buffy's mom, in my opinion. I think Buffy's mom's death was every time. Every time. But seriously, yeah, having the character death be made into a grand event. This is the same thing also with Charles Vane in Black Sails. His character death, I think, is incredibly epic, and I feel like I would also put him in a heroic death category. But I also think that he is incredibly sad death. He was the top death for my Black Sails death video, and just how impactful the reverberation of his death was. Like, oh my gosh, when Jack Rackham is in, like, the last season, getting close to the end, and he's sitting waiting to talk to Eleanor's grandparents, and the like courtier girl comes and sits next to him and is like, oh my gosh, you're a pirate, tell me about Charles Vane. And Jack Rackham sits there and is like, he was my best friend in the whole world. And he starts to get really emotional about it because that was a huge loss. And so to have that callback of this was an incredibly impactful event, it was very sad, and it's still creating grief for the characters moving forward and still has huge implications for the world going forward. So having that character impact makes a huge difference and intensifies the feelings of tragedy and sadness, and makes the character death hit so much harder. The next point is taking the time with the character to say goodbye in the moment of their death as well as after their death. So again, calling back to Boromir's death, how they venerate him after he's passed away as well as the during he is passing, having their last of speech, having that sort of highlighting of that character in the moment of passing, and then how they're treated directly after. That's the same thing with The Last Kingdom with Alfred. After he's just passed, well, his death, I think the whole lead up might have been my favorite. Well, him and Charles Vane. But Alfred's death really is a long experience where we have a huge lead up to it, and then his passing, and then afterwards having his burial. We see his statue, and they're highlighting it in such a grand way that it is showing how important this character was, and then showing the importance of their death. And yeah, giving time and breath to say goodbye, because a lot of characters' deaths, so we all know Game of Thrones, I'm not going to do any spoilers for Game of Thrones, even though it's a very old series, but either way, Game of Thrones has so much death. It's infamous for having so much death, and a lot of it is just breezed by. A lot of it doesn't have any sort of time spent to feel those deaths. It's the same thing actually with Black Sails, and also with Last Kingdom, is there's a lot of death that happens that is just breezed past so quickly. So even if you enjoyed the character, because they haven't had that sort of time to actually be mourned and have that breathing room within the show, it takes away from the experience of it as the viewer, because the show giving time for a character is showing us that we're supposed to care. So if the show has not given us time with a character after death or during the moments of their death and giving us time to breathe with them and say goodbye and then let them go, it takes away from the impact. So really allowing the character to have that spotlight and have that moment of either a grand, like fighting in a battle and having an epic finale to their character, or having a quiet dying in your bed situation. Either one of those, as long as they're giving that spotlight and letting us experience the death with the character, that amplifies the experience of tragedy, and that amplifies the lasting impact and sorrow that is experienced because of their death. Giving us time to say goodbye to a character is super important. Next is the lead up to the character's death. So yes, we love the moment of, and we love to see the moment after, but I think what's also super important for a character to have an impactful death is to highlight that character right before they die. So Black Sails was just the pinnacle of this for me, because Meldoon had no business being as sad as that death was. I was so close in my saddest deaths from Black Sails video to putting that person at the top, because there was no need to have it hit that hard or be that impactful or have that experience be so insane and so intense. But just, him as the pinnacle example of this particular point is we spent the whole beginning of that episode with him and John Silver in the hull of the ship trying to patch up all those holes. Meldoon was like, even though you've lost your leg, we've got you as a crew, you don't ever have to worry about us, pushing you away, like you have value, you're important, like they're really bonding, they're having this whole experience. And then he gets his leg caught on, like, I think it was a cannon or some like big heavy piece of the ship, and then he's drowned. And it was so, and the lead up to him being drowned, and just like really highlighting this character who beforehand was like very minor and not really important and didn't have a lot of screen time. And even if he did have screen time, he was always in relation to someone else. But it was just so out of nowhere, and it really hit so hard. I highly recommend watching that if you haven't already. Obviously now it's a spoiler, but I think it'll still hit hard regardless because of just how much time they spent leading up to his last moments, and then having this really big declaration of friendship and care. And then it again goes into like how John Silver was reacting to Muldoon's death and having that spotlight. So all of these components all work together to create the sadness and the devastation of these characters' deaths. But this one had no business being as grand and fantastic as it was, because it hit so hard and I cried so much. It was so much more devastating than it would have been if they didn't spend so much time in that episode having that emotional building or emotional connection building between him and John Silver, because that was the entire most of the entire episode was with them before the drowning. Yes, of course they do clip back and forth with the characters at the top of the ship and then the two guys in the hull, but like it was so much, and it really just I cried a lot. But it was so good, and I still think about it now because of how well done this death was just perfect. I think the whole thing around, like, that is one of the, like, perfect examples of what made a perfect death scene and why it was so tragic and why it was so emotionally devastating. Even after I've been done Black Sails for a while, and it's still really sad. Next point is, I think that the audience has to see the big death for it to have that impact. Because, you know, I'll use Black Sails as an example with Billy Bones in season 1 dying. I think that there's too many shows and too many pieces of media that do this fake out death where, you know, oh, they have this big death, oh, you, like, you know, see what looks like them dying and, so, you know, whatever, and it's a fake out. And then they come back and it's, oh my gosh, they're back. No, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work anymore. It's been done too many times, and doing the, like, if you don't see the character's body, they're not dead. It just is what it is now. And so that, to confirm the character is dead, but also to see the grand moment of their death, or to see the heart-wrenching moments of their death being gone and having that experience of them being dead. So, you know, Buffy's mom is a great example in terms of, like, we don't see the actual dying of her, but we see her body, and we see, and literally the episode is called The Body, but we see her body and we see Buffy react with it. So that's sort of the moment of her death, is Buffy seeing her body. King Theoden, big one, we see him die. Charles Vane, we see him die. Muldoon, we see him die. I'll never get over that one. It's truly, that was so sad. Alfred, Beaka, we see all of these people's actual moments of death, or right after, in Buffy's mom's case. But I think that it's really important to be able to see their passing and experience that moment with them. One, to confirm, but also because the moment that it's happening is the fuel to the sadness, is the fuel to the experience of the tragedy, and the precursor to grief, because we're in that moment with them, experiencing it with them. Yeah. Seeing it doesn't always have to be on screen, but I think that there has to be a really strong confirmation of the character's death, and or we have to see the body, and then that will go into the character's reactions to the death. But yeah, being with the character in their final moments really hits hard. Next is the character's final words. I think this just, it adds fuel to the fire in the sense of the characters saying their own goodbye. So, mentioned earlier, the goodbye to the character with the scene taking its time to let the character's death breathe, let us experience it, let us be present with it happening. This kind of goes with that in the sense of the character actually saying goodbye to us and to the ones around them. So King Theoden's speech when he's like, I'm going to my forebears, whose company I shall no longer feel ashamed. Like, he is feeling peace at dying and okay to leave, and, you know, that versus, like, you know, Meldune's death. Again, this man was so sad. He Silver to hold his hand because he wanted to have that comfort and that reassurance as he's literally actively drowning. Charles Vane's final words was, get on with it, like, get on with it, motherfucker, or something like that. And, like, it just all is, like, giving them that final grand moment. Yeah, the final words, giving them that space. I think Alfred's, like, final speech with Uhtred, like, you know, just that whole scene with Uhtred was so good. That wasn't necessarily his, like, final words, but it was his taking the time to have his final words with Uhtred and have that goodbye was just fantastic. That whole scene is tears because they're letting the character say goodbye to the characters in the show, like the metaverse of it all, of the character saying goodbye to the other characters, like as a person saying goodbye to another person as they're passing away in the show, but it's also the character, the actor, getting to say goodbye to the audience who's watching and who, you know, has that connection with them and has been following the story and is experiencing that. So it all culminates. So it's the actor getting to say goodbye to the audience, but it's also the character getting to say goodbye to the other characters in the show. And so, yeah, the last words that they get to say make it just feel more sad, because you know that it is the goodbye. You know that it is the farewell. They're not going to be a part of the story anymore, and they're also not going to be a part of the world anymore. And so having that time to let them say goodbye, it really makes it hit even more. And finally, this one has some caveats, because it's not always, but I think that most of the time, who is dying matters. And that comes from how that character was portrayed in the series up until the episode that they die in and the moments of their death. So, for example, Joyce Summers dying hits way harder than Xander Harris dying ever would. Full stop. Father Bayaka dying, I think, hits way harder than, for example, if, like, Citric had have died. And it's always going to be the parental figures, at least for me. If the parental figure has passed away, done. Tears. Most of the time, as long as they're, like, a well-depicted parental figure, that's going to hit really hard. And it's going to be sad. But it doesn't always have to be the parental figures. Even, I think, Charles Vane's death hits more than potentially Flint's would have. And I think that comes from, again, their character's portrayal throughout the show. Because Charles Vane was established as being a character that the other characters had a lot of respect for, and made a point to display his loyalty as well as his interpersonal connections. Whereas Flint was disparaged from episode 1 with the attempted captain change, mutiny situation, voting him off the island sort of deal that was going on there. So that's why I think, again, like, and they had the opportunity to kill Flint, and I feel like it wouldn't have hit that hard. Yes, I think that there's a lot more nuance to Flint's character, and it probably would the way that they would have done it probably would have ended up hitting very hard, but I think that because of how, in the example that I'm utilizing, Charles Vane throughout the whole series, yes, he was called, like, really awful and said that he was, like, the worst, but the way that his character was shown and the connections that he had, the really healthy bonds that he had with Jack, for example, and his loyalty that he showed and his connectedness, and that everybody respected him even though they feared him, even though there was a lot of other components to it, he was still shown to be someone who, like, deeply cared about the situations, even enough to, like, save Flint because of his promise to him when Flint and Blackbeard were fighting. Like, You know, I think that who is dying most of the time matters. Sometimes it doesn't. Muldoon will keep popping up everywhere because he was so tragic, even though he was such a minor character, but they just spent so much time with it. But anyways, so so this list is very much an interconnected components where all of these things matter to build up to a situation of a character's death hitting really hard, having lasting impact, even after the series is done and we've left and said goodbye to the world and still thinking about it years later sometimes, with how sad and how tragic and how impactful that was, and why that death hit so hard. So all of these components really do work together, and you can take one or more. This is also not an exhausted list. There's, I'm sure, many more components that make a character's death hit so hard within a series. These were just the ones that I noticed as I've been going through the saddest character death series that I've been doing on this channel. So yeah, but those are the things that I think really make a character's death hit so hard, and why we feel the tragedy of their goodbyes. What ultimately makes a good death scene is how much effort and attention the show puts into it, and how much they care. Because if they care and make it meaningful, then we, the audience, will take meaning from that character's death. And I think the most important point in if the character's death is going to hit hard is how the other characters react to the passing. And that will indicate to the viewers what and how deeply to feel about it. And those were my findings on what makes a character's death hit so hard. Let me know in the comments which TV show, movie, book series, any piece of media that had the saddest character death for you. I would say that mine is Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Maybe try to avoid some spoilers in the comments, but yeah, let me know, and maybe I'll check it out, and maybe I'll make a list on that piece of media as well of what character death is the saddest for me. If you enjoyed this episode, consider giving a like and subscribing to continue joining us on all of our adventures. But with that, thank you all so much for watching. Everything with love, and we'll see you next time in the treasure trove. Bye!